Sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich zu unserer ersten Sitzung nach der Keynote. Mein Name ist Andreas Koch, ich bin Sozialgeograf hier an der Universität Salzburg, gleichzeitig auch noch involviert am Zentrum für Ethik und Armutsforschung, und ich habe jetzt die Freude, diese erste Sitzung zu moderieren. Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session, the first after the keynote. My name is Andreas Koch. I'm a social geographer at the Department of Geography and Geology, and I'm also affiliated to the Center for Ethics and Poverty Research here in Salzburg. Diese erste Sitzung widmet sich Changing Mobility Routines. Also durchaus etwas, was auch in der Keynote angeklungen ist, vom Wissen zum Wollen zum dann auch Tun. Und wir werden das mit 4 Referaten, denke ich, gebührend auch würdigen. Wir haben 4 Referate. Der erste Referent hat 20 Minuten, die übrigen 3 jeweils 15. Und in Abstimmung mit den Referentinnen und dem Referenten werde ich Sie bitten, Fragen und Kommentare unmittelbar an den jeweiligen Vortragenden dann auch zu stellen und nicht erst am Ende der Sitzung. Wir haben für jeden Vortrag etwa 5 Minuten Zeit. Let's start with the first presentation, which is given by Kiron Chatterjee. He is professor in travel behavior at the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of the West of England in Bristol. And his research expertises and interests are, among others, travel behavior change, longitudinal methods, walking and cycling, and transport modeling. And I think he will give a bit of a profound introduction into that topic of changing routines, changing behavior. And I'm very happy to have you here. Kiron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I seek to understand behavioural change in transport at the individual and at the society level. So I'm coming from the University of the West of England in Bristol in the UK. I do wonder whether you have so much to learn about cycling practice from the UK, because we don't do very well often in the UK with provision for cycling. However, hopefully the research that I do and other colleagues speaking after me will be hopefully useful and interesting to you. The motivation for my talk is as follows. Cycling still has a low mode share in the United Kingdom and in other EU countries, and this is despite a lot more talk these days about the benefits and potential of cycling, and in some cases significant increases in investment. However, there's a lack of evidence on what specific interventions increase cycling, and this is unhelpful when we look to identify effective strategies and measures to increase cycling. So the purpose of this presentation is to give you an understanding of the circumstances in which people stop and start cycling and increase and decrease their cycling based on the best research evidence available. I'm going to briefly talk about the different types of evidence, what's most useful, then summarise the evidence we have in cycling before concluding. So the types of evidence we can use comparisons, cross-sectional comparisons at any one point in time between different places. We might look at this in comparing different countries. In the UK, we may look to the Netherlands with much, much higher levels of cycling. However, the problem is that just transporting the ideas, the designs from the Netherlands to the UK is not really a very realistic proposition. It couldn't be done very quickly, and it may not be the best path forward. And within the United Kingdom, we might look at Cambridge. For me in Bristol, we might look at Cambridge and see what ideas we can gain from Cambridge, which has much higher levels of cycling. But again, it's not going to be very sensible to simply try and transport the solutions in Cambridge to Bristol. It may not necessarily work. So cross-sectional comparisons, not very informative. And there's a need for longitudinal studies which monitor and track change over time. This quote emphasised the value for longitudinal research to identify the factors which encourage people to increase their cycling. Longitudinal studies can help to answer questions such as these. Who changed their cycling behaviour? How did they change it? In what ways did they change it? What purposes are they cycling for? What were the reasons for changing in cycling behaviour? And do people maintain the changes? If they start cycling, do they continue to do that in the long term? So I think those are very useful questions. To me, those are very useful questions worth asking. So it's helpful to have longitudinal research to be able to answer them. So I'll now turn to the evidence. And I'm going to look at the evidence in these 4 areas shown here. First of all, the day-to-day changes in cycling, then changes in cycling in the longer term, year to year. Then I'm going to tell you about research evidence about the role of life events, and then come on to the role of interventions. And all of these 4 areas can be seen in the context of how people's cycling changes over their life course, from young age into older age, and how their cycling can be influenced by factors relating to the individual themselves, the people around them, and then the policies in the wider context and the physical environment around them. Right, day-to-day cycling, we find from studies that, looking at commuter cyclists, about 1/2 of commuter cyclists cycle to work every day. So the other half, sometimes they're cycling to work, but they're also using other modes of transport. And this has been shown in studies in different countries. And looking to find out the reasons why people don't cycle every day, it's been found that the decision to cycle on any one day is influenced by people's own personal schedules, which change from one week to the next, the weather conditions, and also temporary events, like there may be a problem with the bicycle, a flat tyre, for example. And this quote from a commuter cyclist in Bristol, from some research I've done, it illustrates this. This person is saying, travel's largely dictated by weather Monday to Wednesday, as we'll cycle if it's okay, but we'll drive alone if it's extremely wet or if I'm ill. But Thursday to Friday, I always drive as I take my child to the nursery on those days. Now, if we look over the longer term, we have evidence that cyclists' persistence in cycling is less than car drivers. This is from a large representative sample of the English population, and it shows that over 90% of car drivers were found to be driving to work 1 year after they were initially surveyed. With cyclists, it was about 67%, 2/3, were continuing to cycle. And the same data also indicates that public transport users and walkers are more likely to switch to cycling than car drivers. Yeah, you can see there from the bus, 1.7% of bus users switch to cycling, but it's only 0.6% of drivers. So there's a risk then that cycling could attract people that otherwise would be travelling using sustainable modes, public transport or walking. other research has shown that the shift towards more cycling is more likely for those that are already doing some cycling, what might be called the multimodals. So there may be more immediate effectiveness from targeting those who are already willing to cycle for some of their travel. And research has also shown that those who are cycling for non-work are more likely to take up cycling to work than those who don't cycle at all, and the reverse is also the case. So cycling for one person is positively reciprocated in then cycling for other purposes over time. So why do people then change their cycling from year to year? I think this graph gives a first impression. It shows the proportion of the English population who have access to a bicycle and how this varies by age. And this indicates to me that the stages of life are important. And this is well known historically, as illustrated here by this painting, which shows Das Stufenalter des Mannes. And we can see here how, historically, as presented here in the 19th century, the different stages of life of a 19th century gentleman and how their life changes through those periods. And of course, this may affect their choices of mobility. And not being gender-specific, gender-biased, this is, I found there are similar paintings for women as well. So research has then explored the role of different life events and how it affects cycling. And so I'm going to look through some different life events from younger age to older age. So starting here with children, it's been found that their attitudes towards cycling get less positive as they go through their school years, particularly through their teenage years. That's research actually from the United States, but we'd probably see that as well in the United Kingdom. I don't know if that's the case everywhere else in Europe. But it has been shown that going to college, university is associated with an increase in cycling. As might be expected, acquiring a driving licence is associated with a decrease in cycling frequency. And the interesting thing here is that in the UK and other European countries, in the last 10, 20 years, there has been a decrease in licence holding amongst young adults. And one can get into the reasons for that, but I won't do that here. But what this suggests to me is that there's a potential opportunity to increase the amount of cycling of young adults. And in the UK, we don't, although there's less driving by young adults, we haven't really seen much of an increase in cycling amongst young adults. It's been more middle-aged adults. Changes in employment, both in terms of whether people work or not and in where they work, have been associated both with starting and stopping cycling in various studies. And this is shown to be dependent upon the distance to work, which influences whether people are likely to cycle, but also the conditions at the workplace. Another major event in people's lives is moving home. And research here has shown that the access to facilities in the new location influence whether people cycle for utility purposes, whilst for leisure cycling, what's more important is the physical layout of their new location. It's also been shown that the mobility culture of the place that people move to, but also where they have come from, plays an important role. Social relationships are found to be important. Partners, friends and colleagues have been shown to encourage people to return to cycling or to start cycling. And having children is an interesting life event which has shown different results. With large samples, the data tends to show that birth of a child is associated with a decrease in cycling. This is a study here from using German national data. But then qualitative research has shown that having children can have the opposite effect, with new parents being quite willing to cycle more with their young children. Moving to later in life, health concerns can encourage people to take up cycling to protect their health. That's been found to be particularly the case with middle to older age adults rather than younger adults. But of course, health difficulties can prevent continued cycling, although research I've conducted has shown that older adults are very creative in finding ways to adapt and continuing to cycle in later life. E-bikes is just one example of ways of finding to continue. Research from Germany again has shown that retirement is associated with an increase in cycling. So perhaps it would be thought that it would be the opposite, but it could be a great opportunity to encourage more people to cycle at this point. So what you're probably most interested in is interventions and how they have been shown to influence cycling. And in summary, this is a summary across the research. I should say there's not that many very robust studies measuring the impact of interventions in the academic literature, so it's quite hard to draw firm conclusions. But training has been found to increase cycling confidence and frequency of both children and adults. Events have been shown to lead to sustained take-up of cycling, but often events can have quite low participation rates. Measures at the destination, such as workplaces, have been shown to increase modal share if conditions are favourable for cycling, but longer-term effects are unknown. Bike hire systems. It's been found that most users of bike hire systems are switching from either cycling with their own bicycles or public transport or walking. Quite modest proportions are switching from car driving. Of course, any switch is beneficial, though. Physical infrastructure. The extent of new cyclists from the studies that have been carried out has been shown to be quite modest, quite small. But it has been shown that those who live closer to new infrastructure are more likely to increase their cycling. So it does show a causal effect. And probably most interesting is citywide multiple measures. And these have shown increases in cycling in some cases, which have grown in the longer term. I'll just illustrate interventions with a few examples. A ride to work day in Australia, in Melbourne, Victoria State, shown that 1 in 4 people that took part in the ride to work day still rode to work 5 months later. And this is more likely to be women that were first-time cyclists, and they were more likely to continue cycling to work. However, first-time cyclists didn't cycle quite as frequently as established riders. In this particular case, 5,500 people registered, quite a large number, but sometimes events only achieve fairly low participation rates, as I mentioned. An example of physical infrastructure is this one in Cambridgeshire, a new guided busway, which also included traffic-free walking and cycling route, which you can see here, alongside the busway. And it was found that those living closer to the busway were more likely to use it for cycling and to increase their cycle commuting. And those that increased by a substantial amount, 80 minutes per week on average. So this implied that they were new cycle commuters. So that's a welcome finding. Looking at investment across a city, there was a major programme in England which involved a mixture of capital investment and revenue investment, mixture of hard measures and soft measures over a 6-year period. And this was evaluated at the end by looking at census data for cycling to work, and it showed the cycling to work rose by 1 percentage point. And you can see that in the cycling cities there was a notable increase in the period of investment, whilst in other places, comparator places, there was not an indication of such an increase. However, looking into this a bit more, which I did in Bristol, which is one of the cities, comparing the different areas within the city, it was apparent that those areas on the edge of the city, the outer wards, saw a very small increase in cycling, and it was the inner wards, in mid-wards, where there was greater increase in cycling. So we need to be aware of our interventions, that they reach the full population. They're beneficial to everybody and not just certain groups in the population or geographical areas. So, in conclusion, there's evidence that interventions increase cyclists and cycling, although the reach can often be limited, and the research at the moment doesn't really tell us about longer-term impacts. Limitations of evaluation make it difficult to assess long-term impact of specific interventions. I think Rachel Alderid, after me, in the third presentation, will talk about evaluation. Long-term citywide investment appears to be the key, with priority for cycling over other transport modes being associated with more likely success. And my particular message from my own research is that life events increase the likelihood of behavioural change. So I recommend the targeting of people at life change moments to make the best of increases, improvements in infrastructure and other cycling investment and promotion to achieve better outcomes. Thanks for listening.